like 37 people killed. But, I mean, up in present day, environmental terrorists, weathermen terrorists, and more immediately the so-called Antifa terrorists engaging in horrendous conduct, which doesn't get the same publicity that right-wing or fascist neo-Nazi terrorism often gets. I mean, we had the attack on the congressional baseball game. I think we do have, finally, John Faso with us right now. Let's go to the phone. Good morning, Congressman. Thanks for being with us.
Good morning, Fred. I'm sorry to be late. I was meeting with constituents, and the time got away from me.
All right. Well, it's understandable. I'm just sorry we're not going to have as much time with you as I would like. I'd love to hear if you could give us a summary of what you learned from your trip to Israel, which I'm sure was fascinating. And then I want to ask you a little bit about President Trump in Charlottesville.
Sure.
But let's talk about your trip to Israel. If you could give us a summary.
It was a bipartisan trip. The Democrats were actually there a bit ahead of us. There were probably 20 or so Republicans and almost an equal number of Democrats that went over. We had 2 days where we were meeting jointly with Israeli officials, and we toured a missile defense program installation. We met with Prime Minister Netanyahu. We also met with the Prime Minister of the Palestinian Authority, met with many experienced observers of military, economic, and political affairs in the Middle East. We toured areas in Jerusalem, up in the Galilee region, went up to the Golan Heights, was there last Sunday, in fact. So I really got an appreciation for the interesting and complex security issues that the Israelis face.
Well, there were several events going on while you were there of great significance, one internationally involving America, and the confrontation that was really reaching a peak late last week with North Korea, and then also Prime Minister Netanyahu's own legal problems. Let me ask you about the North Korean situation first. Did that come up at all during your trip?
Certainly we were discussing it among ourselves. It did not come up as part of our discussions with either the Israelis or the Palestinians, but it was certainly something that we were aware of and discussing among ourselves. People ask me what is my reaction to some of the rhetoric that went back and forth, and I say that from my vantage point, I think what Teddy Roosevelt said, speak softly and carry a big stick, is a better approach than some of the rhetoric that we've seen that has come from the administration. It's a very dangerous situation. It's very complex. Multiple different administrations over many years, both parties have tried unsuccessfully to deal with the North Korean problem. I think the Trump administration has pushed China very hard, and I think that's appropriate because we need the Chinese who have the most leverage over North Korea to try to moderate their behavior and change their behavior. So I think it's a very dangerous time. It's something that we absolutely cannot permit the North Koreans to have nuclear-tipped ballistic missiles capable of reaching the United States. And so I'm hopeful that diplomacy, economic efforts, and sanctions will persuade the Chinese and the North Koreans that a nuclear Korean peninsula is not in anyone's interest.
John, I read a piece a day or two ago by Chris Ruddy from Newsmax. He had just come back from Israel as well, and his piece was about what he said was the wide popularity of President Trump in Israel. Is that something that you saw as well? Is that something that you can confirm?
Well, I think there's no doubt that many Israelis approve of the change in direction or the change in policy from the Obama to the Trump administration. I do think that Israelis, whether they're on the left or the right, are firmly committed and appreciative of the American involvement with Israel and our mutual security interests. And when we met with the leader, Tzipi Livni, who is the leader of the opposition in the Knesset, and as well as Prime Minister Netanyahu, both of them reinforced the their position that America is the greatest friend of Israel, and that we share many of the same values and interests, and that our mutual cooperation on things like missile defense is really key to a stable world. And I am committed to making sure that we maintain that relationship.
John, would you be willing or able to stay with us for a few extra minutes through the news break?
Yes.
That would be great, because I want to ask you a couple of other questions, and I'd have to drop them if you weren't able to. I'd like to keep you for maybe 10 more minutes after the news.
That's
that would
fine.
be great.
Yep.
Let me ask you this. What was your reaction to the representative of the Palestinian Authority, and whether or not you heard anything that indicated to you that there really was any hope for peace?
Well, the one thing I should say is that all of our meetings were off the record, so I would be violating that commitment if I quoted anyone directly. But suffice it to say, I was struck by the apparent weakness of the Palestinian Prime Minister because of the malign influence of Iran and Hezbollah, Iran and Hamas in that part of the world. Hamas, as you know, is a terrorist organization, and they have effective control of the Gaza Strip, whereas the Palestinian Authority, which is the political organization, was the PLO founded by Yasser Arafat. The Palestinian Authority, which has jurisdiction on the West Bank territories of the Jordan River, that the authority is really actually very weak politically. So I was struck by, in my own view, the weakness of the authority, and their really, again, this is my point of view, not something he expressed, their inability to really deal with Hamas in a effective way. And it's highly unfortunate. People say they desire a two-state solution. Well, in order for that to be, and that has certainly been U.S. policy for a number of years, it's the policy of the Trump administration as well. But the reality is that unless you have another state you can negotiate with, a two-state solution is not going to work. And right now, the Palestinian Authority is neither strong enough nor capable enough to act as that other state with Israel in a two-state solution. From my vantage point.
I would also note, John, in order to have a two-state solution, you have to have two states willing to live with one another in peace. That's a fundamental requirement, and I don't think that exists either.
No, that doesn't.
Go ahead. Fred. Okay. Just quickly, before we have to take the break, did you pick up at all how in Israel, kind of like what we're seeing now in the United States, there's so much polarization politically that everything is viewed through a political filter. Unfortunately, that seems to have happened to our country now as well. Did you have that sense at all?
I really did not. I mean, I know that there's a tremendous amount of political attack against Prime Minister Netanyahu right now on various charges that are.
Yeah, he may be indicted.
Yeah, that are domestic to Israel. It hasn't gotten a whole lot of play here, but there's a lot of controversy relating to his wife and whether
alleged gifts that they received
improper gifts, etc. Yeah. So I don't really know any details about that. And obviously, none of our discussions with Israeli officials really got into that, and certainly none of the discussions with officials got to that. But even when we were talking to the astute political observers and noted editorial writers and other journalists, we really didn't get into the vicissitudes of Israeli domestic politics very much.
John, we got to take a break for the news. Let me know. We're talking to Congressman John Faso of Kinderhook, the 19th Congressional District. He was good enough to stick with us a little bit past the news break. We're going to take that right now, and we'll be back talking about Charlottesville, Virginia.
Now, let's return to Focus on the State Capitol on Talk 1300.
And we're talking, of course, with Congressman John Faso. Before John Faso left for Israel, the mood in the country was pretty tense, I would say, politically polarized. During his visit there, it certainly stayed that way. But now, upon his return, he's dealing with the climate that comes in the wake of Charlottesville, Virginia and the terrible circumstances that occurred down there. Congressman, what's your sense of the significance, if any, of Charlottesville in terms of what you're hearing from constituents, and how do you read it politically?
Well, Fred, you're right. It's extraordinarily polarized. You had a group down there, these neo-Nazis, these white nationalists, whatever we want to call them, KKK, that are just reprehensible and were seeking a confrontation. And unfortunately, they got it. I don't know. I've heard conflicting things about the police work, whether or not they properly kept the groups apart, etc. There's no doubt that this was an awful incident that resulted in really the murder of an innocent protester who was there as a counter-demonstrator to the white nationalists or KKK, whatever they are. I think it's a moment where I think the country and leaders in the country need to call for unity, and we need to call for reconciliation and to try to have people understand that, yes, we can have strong political views, we can have differences in our point of view, and we have every right under the Constitution to express them. Even heinous views have a right within reason and within limit to be expressed. Sure. But the kind of violent confrontation that took place there has really no place in our political and civic discourse.
What do you think of President Trump's handling of it, though? As you well know, he's been widely criticized, but oftentimes by people who've been criticizing him for everything anyway, but also by some Republicans and others for his supposedly not strong enough initial condemnation of these neo-Nazi types. What do you think of President Trump's conduct?
I think sometimes he has a tin ear on these things. I mean, when they issued a remembrance about the Holocaust a few months ago and didn't mention the Jewish
Jews
people.
were the victims of it.
I thought that was just a tremendous mistake and oversight, and the failure to call out these groups for what they were and what they are, I think, was a tremendous mistake on Trump's part and on the part of the White House communications team. Fred, I really can't understand it. I think that it's very important for us to call these things what they are, and this is just a extremist, hate-filled group that was trying to provoke the very thing that occurred. They were trying to provoke conflict, just like you saw when the other side in at Berkeley a few months ago. When you
I was going to say, though, John, some of the anti-protesters, the Antifa so-called groups, want confrontation as well, which is not to say that they were responsible for this being initiated, because this was this extreme neo-Nazi type group that got the parade permit, and they were looking for confrontation. Right. But there are also people against them who want the confrontation as well.
Well, Fred, look at the anti-globalization terrorists that marched at the G20
Seattle and other places, anarchists
meeting in Germany a few weeks ago. Look at the folks in Berkeley that manhandled a speaker and a professor out at Berkeley when this far-right conservative was invited to speak at some place. And look when Charles Murray spoke in that's the one I was actually referring to. When Charles Murray, who is has some controversy attached to him, but who's generally regarded
scholar.
He's a very eminent scholar, and the fact is they wouldn't permit him to speak. And so these kind of tactics, you saw in Seattle a couple of years ago, the anti-globalization marches at the day of Trump's inauguration in Washington.
Yes.
You saw people from the left committing acts of wanton violence and property destruction. So these things happen, and we should condemn both of them. Obviously, when someone is killed, it draws special condemnation, as was the case in Charlottesville the other day. I heard about this, Fred, about 10 o'clock at night on Saturday night when I was in the Galilee region of Israel, and frankly had very sporadic and incomplete information. The next day was a busy travel day on buses up to the Golan Heights, and I really didn't have a chance to absorb and read the news accounts of this until I got home early yesterday morning. So I issued a statement condemning this as well, and I think the president should have been much more forceful and direct about this in his initial statement.
The Charles Murray incident, the most recent one, was at Middlebury College.
That's right, Middlebury College. You're right.
Just finally, John, if I could, in terms of the political fallout from what happened on Saturday, how damaging, if damaging at all, do you think it is to Republicans like yourself and Republicans around the country? Because Democrats are making an effort to tag you with some kind of indirect responsibility as they blame Donald Trump.
I don't think. I think that's ridiculous, and I think that it is a shame when you see political candidates and political officials, elected officials, trying to make hay out of this politically. This is a tragedy. A young woman was murdered by apparently a deranged person attached to this neo-Nazi cult. And the last thing responsible elected officials should be doing, or candidates should be doing, is trying to make hay out of it politically. That would be reprehensible and irresponsible.
But certainly not unheard of and not uncommon in the world of politics.
Well, Fred, be it as it may, I certainly am not going to engage in it.
Fair enough. Congressman John Faso, we thank you for joining us this morning. I'm sure your trip to Israel was very interesting, and look forward to talking to you about it and many other things again.
It was a fabulous trip, Fred, and again, my apologies for being a little tardy getting on this morning.
Fair enough, understandable. Constituents come first. Thanks again for being with us, Congressman John Faso, Republican from Kinderhook, former Assembly Minority Leader, amongst other outstanding achievements in New York politics that he had. He was the Republican candidate for governor at one time and was a Republican candidate for state controller, was a key initial advisor as well to Governor George Pataki when George Pataki was actually acting like the candidate George Pataki promised to act as a fiscal conservative, but that when that was abandoned, I think John Faso and Pataki had a genuine and understandable falling out. We're going to be joined in a couple of minutes by a guy